You have to help them in any way that they need. And whatever they need is really up to, their feelings at the time. So you can see how almost any commandment can be violated, can contradict the mitzvah of honoring one's parents. So here again, when it comes to the mitzvah of honoring parents, the oral tradition is once again very clear that we do not honor parents when they are asking us to transgress another commandment. So if your parent asks you to help them steal, the answer is, sorry, I cannot help you with that. I don't know if you even want to say I would love to help you, but I'd love to help you with other things, but I cannot help you with that. And the same would be if it's Shabbos violation, or they say, please come eat the food I prepared, which is not kosher, or whatever else it might be. If your parent wants you to honor them by transgressing another commandment, we never honor our parents by transgressing another commandment. The reason for this is, and the Torah, we learn this from the fact that the Torah says to respect your parents, but keep Shabbat. The but keep Shabbat teaches you that, but make sure you keep all the other commandments first. The reason is because your parents are also obligated to follow Hashem's commandments. Not only are they obligated for themselves to follow Hashem's commandments, given that all Jews are responsible for each other, they're obligated for you to follow Hashem's commandments. So when they're telling you to transgress a commandment, to honor them by transgressing a commandment, that is actually a dishonor to them. Because they're supposed to make sure you do all the commandments. You follow all the commandments. So therefore, we would never transgress a commandment in order to honor our parents. So that is a handful. There are more. There are a number more. Remember the 613 commandments. And you can imagine there's 248 active commandments, positive commandments, and 365 negative or avoidance commandments. So you can imagine how many possibilities there are of the commandments conflicting, right? There are hundreds, if not thousands, of possible examples of commandments conflicting. A number of them are addressed directly in the Torah or in our oral tradition. I just gave you 3 examples that are addressed very clearly in the oral tradition: circumcision on Shabbat, commandments that conflict with the commands to avoid danger and save a life, and commandments that conflict with honoring parents. I gave you these examples because they're more common and more practical, but there are countless others. What about the ones that the Torah doesn't mention? I mean, the possibilities are almost endless. They're in the thousands, certainly, if not tens. The possibilities keep going. And certainly the Torah and the oral tradition certainly did not address each and every single one. What about when the question is not addressed? What is the law then? So the oral tradition gives us also a general rule what to do when 2 commandments conflict. The rule is that the positive mitzvah, the active mitzvah, generally supersedes the negative or the avoidance mitzvah. So the mitzvah to do supersedes the mitzvah not to do. An example would be, there is a prohibition in the Torah of not eating grain from the new harvest until the 17th of Sivan, or the 3rd day of Passover. In the diaspora, that's the 4th day of Passover. So we, at least today that the temple no longer stands, we are forbidden from eating grain from the new harvest until the 17th of Sivan. And that is the prohibition that we call Chodosh. We once did a class dedicated to that particular law and how it applies today and how practically it is to be observed. So what happens if you have matzah that is Chodosh, that is grain from the new harvest? Now we know we have to eat matzah. It's a mitzvah to eat matzah on the first night of Passover at the Seder. but you're not allowed to eat this grain. It's a prohibition to eat this matzah until the third day of Passover in Israel, or the fourth day of Passover in the diaspora. So what do? What if that's the only matzah you were able to get? You couldn't find any other matzah. You worked hard, you tried, did everything you could. You couldn't find any other matzah. The rule is that the active commandment, eating matzah on the night of Passover, supersedes the avoidance commandment, the mitzvah lo taseh, of do not eat grain from the new harvest. And therefore, you would be able to eat the matzah. There is some limit to this, however. This rule only applies if a single positive commandment contradicts a single negative commandment. A single active commandment contradicts or conflicts with a single avoidance commandment. However, many of the 613 commandments actually have both an active commandment, a mitzvah aseh, and an avoidance commandment, a mitzvah lo taseh, that are exactly the same thing. For example, and they're two opposites of the same thing. For example, the Torah tells us, do not work on Shabbat, which, according to our oral tradition, is 39 particular forms of work. The Torah also tells us, rest on Shabbat. Do not work on Shabbat is an avoidance. Do not do. A mitzvah lo taseh. Rest on Shabbat is an active commandment. Do. Rest on Shabbat. How do you rest on Shabbat? By not doing any of those 39 forbidden forms of work. So it's really the same thing. It's telling you the same thing, one in a wording that gives you an active wording, and one in an avoidance wording. Avoid working, do not work, and do rest. It's essentially the same thing. So then, when a person were to transgress and perform do one of those 39 forms of forbidden work on Shabbat, not only have they violated the avoidance commandment, the mitzvah lo taseh, do not work on Shabbat, they have also violated the active commandment of resting on Shabbat. They have failed to rest on Shabbat. In such an instance, the active commandment will not supersede a commandment that is both active and avoidance. So therefore, and Yom Tov, the holidays, has a similar thing. So therefore, if, for example, a person needs to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but the only shofar that is available for them on Rosh Hashanah would require them there's no shofar in their town, and they would have to drive to the next city in order to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Well, shofar is an active commandment. Listen to the shofar. Not driving on the Yom Tov, on the holiday, is both an active and an avoidance commandment. Do not work on the holiday, rest on the holiday. There's both. You'll be transgressing both, and therefore you would not be able to drive to go hear the blowing of the shofar. Also, another exception to this rule, again, as a rule, the active commandment supersedes the avoidance commandment, unless the avoidance commandment also essentially is paired with an active commandment itself, as resting on Shabbat or resting on the holidays. Another time that the active commandment will not supersede the avoidance commandment is if you could perform the active commandment without transgressing the avoidance commandment. For example, a person has two pieces of matzah in front of them. One piece of matzah is from the new harvest, chadash, that is forbidden to eat until the fourth day of Pesach, and the second piece of matzah is from the old harvest that you're allowed to eat. Well, you have to eat matzah because you're sitting at the Seder and it's a mitzvah to eat matzah. Eat the matzah you're allowed to eat. Don't eat the other stuff. And even if the other matzah you're allowed to eat is a long walk, it's an hour walk, go take the hour walk and get the matzah you're allowed to eat. Go to the effort and get the matzah you're allowed to eat. Don't take the forbidden matzah. You can only eat that forbidden matzah if you don't have any other matzah whatsoever. What if you could have gotten the matzah and you didn't try hard enough? You could have traveled earlier and you didn't work hard enough. Well, that's an issue that's debated, let's just say. It's debated among scholars as to which one you should actually do. Yes?
So are we to assume that when we buy the matzah for Passover that it's last year's harvest?
Mm-hmm. All matzah that you're going to buy from Passover is going to be from last year's harvest.
Does it say it somewhere on the package?
It should say yashan. Yashan is a term from last year's harvest. Chadash means from this year's harvest. So yes, it should say yashan on the package. Yes.
So is it in the oral tradition that rabbis can do services on Sabbath because they're working?
That's a very, very good question. Michael, that's a very good question. Before I get to Michael's question, I just want to add, we spoke in detail about the laws of Chadash and Yashan, the prohibition of not eating grain from the new harvest until the fourth day of Passover. We mentioned that today most people don't worry about it too much, although some are extra careful to make sure. But generally, we don't worry about it too much because by and large, the way the grain system works today, you get grain from long time ago. Because of all the futures trading and all the grain trading, it takes a long time till it gets to your kitchen. So you don't have much to worry about today. Sorry, so I just want to clarify that before we moved on. To Michael's question, which is a very good question, how does the rabbi work on Shabbos? I sometimes tell people that I'm the only Jew that works on Yom Kippur. So that's an excellent question, how a rabbi can work on Shabbos. Is there a mitzvah, is there an active commandment for a rabbi to work on Shabbos? So I don't think so. Nowhere in the Torah does it say rabbis shall work on Shabbos. In fact, the rabbis aren't mentioned anywhere in the Torah. And who invented the rabbi and where the rabbi concept even came from? We once did a class on Moses was certainly not a rabbi. Where did the rabbi concept come from, and how it evolved, and what the value of rabbis are is a subject of another discussion. But there's certainly no commandment to be a rabbi or for rabbis to work on Shabbat. The truth is that the work that the rabbis do on Shabbat does not violate any of the 39 forms of work that the Torah prohibits on Shabbat. The rabbis don't turn the lights on and off. The rabbis don't drive. They don't sew. They don't harvest. They don't write. They don't erase. We don't even use microphones. So we don't violate any of the 39 forms of prohibited work on Shabbat. When we say work, it doesn't mean you can't do your job. It means you can't do any of the 39 forms of prohibited work. So the rabbi can work on Shabbat, and if your particular work does not involve any of the 39 forms of prohibition, if it's a spiritual work, for example, your job is to study Torah full time because you're a yeshiva student, you absolutely should do your work on Shabbat. If it is a mundane work, we're supposed to avoid it. However, in extreme circumstances, you can do that work. And in places where Jews were, had a very hard time keeping Shabbat, such as in the Soviet Union. We've done some classes on that, on difficult times to keep Shabbat. That's one of the solutions that Jews came up with. They would work as guards or watchmen, and that doesn't avoid any of the 39, depending on what exactly they have to do. It wouldn't avoid any of the 39 prohibitions. Yes, Marla?
It's my understanding that on Shabbat, anything to do with Torah, Judaism, anything like that is not considered work. So what the rabbi is
Well, there's two different issues. There's 39 particular actions, plus a handful more added by the Supreme Council, the Sanhedrin over the years, that we are forbidden from doing on Shabbat. All those things we're not allowed to do, unless saving a life or certain other exceptions. But generally, we're not allowed to do them on Shabbat. Not rabbis, not nobody. No one's allowed to do them. Doesn't matter. Most people's careers involve one of those 39 forms of forbidden work, or one of the rabbinic shvut, what we call one of the later added additions, but involves one of those additions. The rabbi's job working in the synagogue, essentially getting up and giving a sermon, maybe, leading services, usually the cantor does that. The rabbi's job, whatever it might be on Shabbat, does not involve any of those 39 forms of forbidden work. Now, in theory, people can have jobs that do not involve any of the 39 forms of forbidden work either. The example I gave, which was actually common in some places where Jews struggled. We did a class a few months ago, you might remember, of the challenge of keeping Shabbat and times in history when it was very, very hard to keep Shabbat and how Jews risked everything to keep Shabbat. But one of the solutions they came up with in such situations was to find one of these lines of work. And one of the classic is being a guard. A guard doesn't do anything. They just stand there. And so you could be a guard without violating any of the commandments. And in the Soviet Union, for example, that was a common job for Shabbos observant Jews because you couldn't not work. It would be too dangerous, right? Because in the Soviet Union, you go to jail for not working, and you had to work, and you wanted to work that didn't violate Shabbat. That's what you would do. Now, normally, that's an extreme circumstance. Normally, we would not tell someone who has a job as a guard, you can go to work on Shabbat. The problem is, there's a few problems, but primarily the problem is that it is not in the spirit of Shabbat. It's a mundane action. The rabbi's line of work, however, is holy. It's not mundane, and therefore they can go about their line of work on Shabbat. For that matter, as we said earlier, the mohel, the ritual circumciser, works on Shabbat, right? They do circumcision on Shabbat because their job happens to be in the one line of work that violates the Shabbat. Yes?
How did people that were agrarian do this when they had animals to feed, cows to milk on Shabbat? I mean, you can't not milk your cow.
That is an excellent question. How do you milk cows on Shabbat? So we have a workaround, a trick to milk cows on Shabbat. Not for now. Feeding animals, you certainly can feed animals on Shabbat. There's no issue with that. But milking cows is a subject.
I just wondered how they got around that.
They did. There's a workaround. There is a workaround, yes. Until now, I gave you 3 examples of mitzvahs that conflict with other mitzvahs, where an active mitzvah conflicts with an avoidance mitzvah, or the opposite. And firstly, circumcision on Shabbat, which we said, you go ahead and do it. That's the commandment. Save a life and prohibition not to put a life in danger. And then we spoke also about where that supersedes most commandments except for 3 groups of commandments. And then the mitzvah of honoring parents, which never supersedes any other commandment. And then we gave you general rules for everything that is not explicitly mentioned in the tradition, that a active commandment, a positive commandment, mitzvah taseh, generally supersedes the negative commandment, do not violate. However, that's only if it is a single negative commandment. If it is a negative commandment paired, or an avoidance commandment paired with an active commandment, then the other active commandment will not supersede it. Also, that is only if it doesn't, if you have no other options. If you have a way of fulfilling the commandment without transgressing another one, fulfill the commandment without transgressing it. Get it all, do it all right. Now, this is all if the mitzvah doesn't come as a result of a transgression. The act of the mitzvah might involve the matzah itself is grain that is forbidden to eat because it's from the new harvest. So the act itself is that might involve a forbidden act. But the mitzvah didn't because of or from a forbidden act, then the mitzvah doesn't even count. For example, let's say you need well, I guess we're sticking with matzah. It's right after Passover. Let's say you need a matzah. You need a piece of matzah to eat at your Seder. You don't have any matzah, nor do you have any money to buy any matzah. Nor does anyone want to give you a piece of matzah. Every Jew you know around is stingy and refuses to give you a piece of matzah. Or the same matter could be if you jump 6 months to Sukkot, you need to shake the lulav on Sukkot, and you have no lulav, and nobody wants to give you a lulav. And so the only solution then is to steal a piece of matzah or steal a lulav. Well, Matzah is an active commandment, right? Stealing, do not steal, is a avoidance commandment. Active commandment should supersede an avoidance commandment. You should be, based on the rule we just said, you should be able to steal to get your matzah. That doesn't sit right with some of you, right? However, it doesn't work over here. Why doesn't it work? The Talmud tells us because it's what we call mitzvah haba al yedei avera. It is a mitzvah, a commandment that is being fulfilled through a transgression. You are transgressing in order to fulfill another commandment. Not that the fulfillment itself involves also a transgression, but you are doing a transgression, and that transgression, the thing you transgressed with, you're then using to fulfill a mitzvah. So you stole, and you're taking a stolen item and doing a mitzvah with it. That doesn't work. Your mitzvah with a stolen item doesn't count. Hashem says, I don't want your stolen matzah. That doesn't count as eating matzah on Passover. I don't want your stolen lulav. That doesn't count as shaking the lulav. So normally a active commandment supersedes a avoidance commandment. A do commandment supersedes a don't commandment. However, if you need to do, if the avoidance commandment is being transgressed as a step in order to fulfill the positive commandment, it becomes not that they're being transgressed simultaneously, but it's being transgressed in order to fulfill the positive commandment. And then the item itself is now a stolen item. In other words, it retains its stolen act. That's very different from, let's say, if you're traveling in order to do a mitzvah. Or if you do one thing in order to do another, but here the item itself is stolen. It remains a stolen item. And since the item itself remains a stolen, forbidden item, you cannot do a mitzvah with it. And that's what we call a mitzvah haba ba'avera, a mitzvah that comes with a transgression. Yes?
So basically, in general, it's better to do no harm. Or the transgression.
Well, no. Generally, the active commandment supersedes the avoidance commandment.
Go down in order to come up. It's like
generally the active commandment will supersede. So you can eat the matzah, even though it's forbidden to eat grain from the new harvest. You're allowed to. But
like more general than the other.
Well, that might be just because you see stealing is a commandment that you better relate to. You feel it kind of irks you more than eating the new harvest. And I understand that. But the rule of the commandment is not because stealing irks us more and makes us feel more uncomfortable. The rule is that the problem is you're performing the commandment with a stolen item. If you're performing the commandment with a stolen item, then it's a mitzvah that comes through sin. And a mitzvah that comes through sin is not a mitzvah. You haven't fulfilled your obligation.
So in my mind, what I said holds true.
It holds true with regard, in this case, when you're stealing in order to do a mitzvah. Yes. If you steal in order to do a mitzvah, yes, then it will hold true. Yes. Yes, but most other times the positive commandment will supersede the active commandment will supersede the avoidance commandment. Now, there were a handful of times where our sages said that even though the commandment itself, to fulfill a commandment, does not transgress any other commandments, they said, even so, you should not fulfill this commandment in order to keep you from transgressing a more serious commandment. And this, they said this in a handful of cases, and two very notable ones that I'm going to mention right now that are very similar. One is, we already know that it is an active commandment to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. It is also a avoidance commandment not to perform any of the 39 forbidden forms of work on Shabbat. we know that the prohibition of not performing the 39 forbidden forms of work on Shabbat is not only an avoidance command, but also an active command. We're actively commanded to rest on Shabbat. So now, when Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbat, our sages said one of the 39 forbidden forms of work on Shabbat is carrying in a public area. And our sages were afraid that people will carry their shofar. And therefore they said, in order to make sure you do not transgress the severe transgression of Shabbat, which we said is both an active and avoidance commandment, and it's a very severe transgression, they said, don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah when Rosh Hashanah is Shabbat. From the same way they said on Sukkot, when Sukkot is on Shabbat, we're afraid people are going to carry their lulav. Don't shake the lulav on Sukkot when Sukkot is on Shabbat.
Okay.
And so even though technically blowing the shofar does not transgress any commandments, because it doesn't transgress any of the 39 forbidden forms of work, blowing a horn is not a form of work forbidden on Shabbat, and shaking a lulav is certainly, taking a branch is certainly not a form of work forbidden on Shabbat. They said, nevertheless, don't do it. This was a rabbinic injunction made by the Sanhedrin, by the Supreme Council of Judaism in the early days of Judaism. And they said, don't do it because we're afraid that it will lead to Shabbat violation. So this gives you a general framework. I give you 3 actual examples and then a general framework to know what to do when 2 commandments conflict with each other, a active commandment, a mitzvot aseh, and an avoidance commandment or negative commandment, a mitzvot lo ta'aseh, what to do. In each particular case, if you actually reach a real case, since I haven't given you all the details, I would strongly encourage you to consult with your rabbi. Hopefully they are well versed and will know the exact halacha, the exact law in that case. What I hope this does bring home, though, is that the 613 commandments of the Torah are not just general rituals that we're supposed to do and general ethics that we're supposed to follow. They are very specific instructions of exactly what we're supposed to do. They're not just guidance. They are rules, and very clear rules. The system of halacha is a rule book. It's a law book, or it's a series of books, but it's a system of rules and laws. It's not just actions that we do and actions that we avoid, good things to do and not such good things to do. It is a very organized, structured, detailed book of rules. And that is because Judaism is not just a guide as to how we should generally live our lives, how Hashem wants us to live in general. It's not just a cultural thing that we do. It's not just an ethical system. We believe that Judaism is a system of commandments. Hashem gave us 613 commandments that we committed to follow. They're essentially a series of rules, a very, very large series of rules that we, our people, as a people, have committed to live our lives by these rules because Hashem has asked us to. And He wants us to follow these rules to the letter, exactly as they're supposed to be. And there's a rule for each thing. What do you do in this scenario? This is how you do it. And in this particular case, this is how you do it. And in this, every case and any possible thing that can come up, halacha will tell you this is exactly how you're supposed to follow it. This is exactly what you're supposed to do, what you must do, what you're not allowed to do. And it gives exact details as to how to follow the rules exactly. And that's why we have to study these rules, know these rules, and because of course we cannot know all these rules, that, going back to earlier we were talking about rabbis, that is the primary role of the rabbi. The rabbi is essentially an advisor, not an intermediary, God forbid, between a Jew and Hashem. Jews require no intermediaries. We don't need the rabbi to do anything, or the rabbi doesn't absolve any sins for you. The rabbi, is an advisor that hopefully is better versed in the halacha, in the laws, and can help guide you of exactly how to follow the rules that Hashem has given us. And that is what the Torah is about, not general book of guidelines, not general culture or how we should live life, where we can go ahead and feel and decide what we feel is better, what we like, or perhaps even what follows modern culture, right? Sometimes our modern culture doesn't fit so well with the laws and rules that Hashem gave us. And, I don't like that rule, or I like this rule better. No, this is a very strict book of rules that Hashem has given us and told us exactly how we're supposed to follow each and every single rule, even when they conflict. In each conflict case, we have guidelines of exactly what we're supposed to be doing for each and every situation. And each and every situation has been discussed in our books of halacha and has been dealt with in great detail. And we're supposed to follow the Torah exactly as Hashem gave it to us. That is Hashem's will. When we do that, we're following the will of Hashem. We're following his instructions in this world. And that creates this enormous, amazing connection between us and our Creator. So I know this was somewhat of a complicated class, but hopefully it was also, you got a real view into how Jewish law works. I hope it was very rewarding as well. And so I thank you all for joining. Thank you, Letitia, again, who's not here, for sponsoring our breakfast. And we will be back, God willing, next week, where we will talk about Arla, which is the fruit within their first 3 years.